This story begins with a girl who had hair the color of fire. Her name is Irina Reinkars. At the time, she was 20 years old, and she's the eldest daughter of the Count of the Reinkars family. The girl sat near the window and watched, looking at the various leaves on the trees. Irina was wearing a short-sleeved dress. Then a man came up to her, a plaid in his hands, and he said it was still cold at this time of year. His name was Henry. Irina thanked him, and the guy replied that he was always happy to help her, and added that he would make hot tea. She and Henry have been married for 3 years, but it's exactly the same as when they were first dating. Her husband makes her really happy, and it would be wonderful for her if they did have children. Irina looked at the birds on the branch, and she felt sad. Henry shifted her gaze to himself and asked, "Does she really still think about children?" The girl lowered her head and replied in a sad voice that it was something she had been dreaming about since the day they met. She is excited to be born and to look like him, to develop and play with him in their beautiful garden. For the boy to grow up to be as good a doctor as he is, that's what Irina wants more than anything. Henry kissed her hand and said that she was the most important person to him, and she was sure to be cured and healthy soon. Then he handed the girl the tea and said that he had heard that the Count had gone to great lengths to get it for her. Irina looked into the cup and said that when they first met, he had made her this same tea. At that moment, Irina remembered their very first meeting. She was sitting in her room reading a book. Suddenly, someone knocked on her door and asked if he could come in. Irina freaked out and said that of course he could. She immediately slammed the book shut. The girl was a little unexpecting to have visitors, especially guests like this. So when a guy walked into the room, he was incredibly handsome, and it took her breath away. He came closer and said he was Henry, her new doctor. After that, he bowed a little and said it was a pleasure to meet him. At that time, Irina could not even imagine that he would turn out to be her fiancé in the future. He made her a tea and told her it was the red dandelion extract the Count had mentioned, and he poured her a cup of hot and fragrant tea for the girl to drink. Irina thanked him immediately. Just like that, the inexperienced new doctor met the Count's eldest daughter. The Countess was one of the most famous socialites in the empire. The Count always claimed that his daughter's happiness was his top priority. But people didn't understand why he chose such an unusual choice of groom for his daughter. That's how the perfect wedding came about. Even though Irina was always quite morbid, thanks to Henry they created the perfect marriage, just like in the books. Everything was perfect until his evil smile and intentions were revealed. Toward evening, they had a heavy downpour. There was chaos in the manor because no one expected it to rain. The maids ran down the street carrying all the things out of the arbor and said the rain was very sudden, asking if the mistress would be all right, for it was very cold. The other maid replied that she would be fine because she had such a kind and caring husband. At this time in the manor, Henry hugged the girl and told her that they had been together for 3 years. Afterward, he angrily added that she was a good girl for holding out so well. The guy smiled and said that this would be her last day, and unfortunately her dreams were not destined to come true. He said she would have such a beautiful death, to fall asleep forever in the arms of her beloved husband. Irina felt her body start to behave strangely. Then, hearing his words, startled, I asked him what he was talking about. But the guy said you can't just trust people, despite all her good qualities. She would die before she could blossom. Henry said it's because she's very stupid and also because of her abusive parents. She's been singing red dandelion extract since she was a little girl. The girl was very surprised. She didn't understand what he was talking about. She couldn't believe that her father had made her drink this tea when she was a child. But the man kept talking and said he didn't need her to hate him. After all, her father had asked him to kill her. And that's because he's Count Reinkars. At that moment, Irina began to feel quite ill. She began to choke and cough violently. The girl could no longer stand on her feet. She tried to put 2 fingers in her mouth to spit out that awful tea. But she couldn't do anything, so she just sat on the floor and cried. Henry walked over to her and put his hand on her shoulder, and told her it was useless. This poison had been embedded in her body for decades. He then asked that she simply remember who first poured her this tea when this unknown disease appeared. The girl slapped him on the arm and told him that her daddy would never do that, and it's all lies he's telling. At this time, in his estate, Count Reinkars, who was also Rihanna's father, was studying the documents. He liked the sound of rain very much. He was glad that from now on they wouldn't need any more red dandelion extract, and the deal with that guy who only cared about money would finally be finalized. Irina thought that her father checked on her every morning and prepared the medicine himself until she fell asleep. He was so affectionate with her. The girl doesn't understand why he did that. When Henry asked her why she thought he was able to marry her, though a commoner himself, but he didn't wait for her answer and said it was all because the girl's father had asked him to. Then he asked if he had something more important than his own daughter. Irina could not stand it. With tears in her eyes, she screamed, asking the guy why on earth he had done this to her. You asked if he never loved her and all those years were just lies. Henry chuckled and said that he was certainly grateful to be in a relationship with her. He had purposely increased his medication dosage that day because it was the last day he would be able to be her husband. He said it was the smallest part of what he could do. Irina felt her brain begin to fog gradually. She pushed the man away and decided that she needed to escape immediately. She couldn't get far, however. Henry didn't even bother to stop her because he knew that's what would happen. The girl ran some distance. After that, she fell to the floor, exhausted. She didn't understand what was happening to her body and why it stopped obeying her. Henry looked at her contemptuously then, and said that he had already told her it was useless to do that, hadn't he? The girl could not move, so her tormentor went over and picked her up in his arms, then began to carry her to the bed. For a while Irina tried to resist, but her body was already completely out of her control, so she just screamed. When he put her to bed, so said he himself had just recently learned some very entertaining information. Namely, that of all the Count Rainkar's family, she is the one with the most outstanding abilities. Then he whispered in her ear that that was probably why she should die, because of her abilities as a child. The Count's house was in great chaos, and she was giving him a great deal of trouble. Covering the girl with a blanket, he told her to remember this on her journey to the underworld. Irina wanted to scream for someone to hear her and save her, but she couldn't. She had no strength left even to say a word. The girl decided that she would never let it happen again, even if she died. And then suddenly the girl, for a while still lying there, felt someone's touch on her forehead. And afterward, she heard a voice telling her to shorten the darkness and let the starry flowers bloom. When the moon hides, she should step into the shadows and walk straight toward him. And after that, the voice was silent, and for some time Irina just lay there, as if she were asleep. But then suddenly she heard someone trying to call her, and she wondered if she was in a dream now. But then she heard the familiar voice again. He was asking for Mistress to wake up. And so, when Irina opened her eyes, she saw the frightened face of the maid, who was screaming and kept asking for her to wake up. When she saw Lola, she was very surprised, but the maid asked if she was all right. Then Irina was very surprised because this girl is a maid who worked in the mansion before she was married. But it was still deep night, so the girl went back to bed and heard that voice again, asking her to tame her darkness and let the starry flowers bloom. And when the moon hid, she was to step into the shadows and come to him. Irina suddenly started screaming in her sleep. She couldn't wake up, so she just made various sounds, which frightened the maid. Lola immediately ran over to her and tried to sit the girl down. Her hair suddenly began to glow. Then the girl shed a tear because she didn't want all this and thought she should run. At that moment, the maid called for the Count, Irina's father. When he came running, he immediately asked what was going on. Lola was very frightened. She said she didn't know what was going on, and apparently Mistress had suddenly had another seizure. Then the father took the girl in his arms and told her to hold on because he would now do everything in his power to save her. Then Irina began to open her eyes suddenly. She didn't much realize where she was going, but her father, seeing that she was waking up, put her back to bed. At that moment, some young guy walked in. He was still in his robe because it was still late at night. This boy was the eldest son of the Reinkar's family. As soon as he entered the room, he immediately turned to his father. His name was Eden. However, the family simply abbreviated it, calling the boy Ed. When the Count saw his son, he was immediately angry and asked why he had come. He should be in his bed now, for he has to go to the Imperial Palace the next day. He should get a good night's sleep. However, the guy wasn't listening to him. He looked at the girl, who was still lying unconscious in the bed, and asked if his sister was all right. The father sighed heavily and said that she was fine. She had fallen asleep again, so she was gaining strength. After that, he asked his son to go to rest as soon as possible. He started shoving him in the back and said that otherwise the schedule would be broken tomorrow, which is a very bad thing, as he knows. Before going out, Ed took one more look at his sister, who lay sleeping. She seemed breathless, but the girl was alive. Then he went out into the hallway and, meeting Lola, began yelling at her, saying that if she woke anyone else up too, she would have no mercy. The girl was very frightened, but she said it would not happen again. The night went on as usual. And then after a while, Irina suddenly opened her eyes. Then she saw the maid in front of her. It was Lola. When she saw that Mistress was awake, she immediately asked how she was feeling. The girl was very surprised to see that tears were coming to Lola's eyes, because the Count had yelled at her and reprimanded her, but she still asked Mistress how she was feeling. Irina sat down on the bed and immediately asked what was wrong. The maid explained that she had had a terrible seizure in the middle of the night. The girl was surprised to hear this. She realized that she had been saved, or that it had all been a dream. Lola said that she was really very scared for Mistress. Irina ignored her words and asked how old she was now. The maid was very surprised at this question, but replied that she would be 20 this year. Then she asked if the lady was sure it was not necessary to call a doctor. Irina looked out the window and thought that this was the same spring when she turned 20, the same time she'd first met Henry. Then the girl remembered his words before she left. He had sounded very persuasive and angry, and she had loved him all these years. Irina clenched her hands into fists as hard as she could because of her resentment. Then Lola immediately ran from the room and shouted that she was going to call the doctor. The girl cried. I thought that her father, whom she trusted so much and loved more than anything else in the world, had been poisoning her all this time. Even the cookies and candy that Ed had secretly brought her, to please the girl, they may have been poisoned as well. Irina reflected that from now on she was obliged to question everything and scrutinize everything, in order not to repeat the same mistake that had happened either in the dream or in her past reality. When the morning finally came, Irina went out to the gazebo, where warm tea and various cakes were waiting for her. But after a while the girl heard a very familiar voice, which even gave her goosebumps. It was her father, of course. He came close to her and told her that if she didn't eat breakfast, she wouldn't even be able to take her medicine, and afterward added that he had heard that she had refused to see Henry that day. Irina did not answer him, but thought about how blind she was, because it was obvious and visible at first sight. Then her father said that Henry was a very good doctor, and he would help her heal. But Irina, who turned away from him, said she was fine, which is why she refused the appointment. The Count turned to his daughter and said that new flowers had recently been planted in the garden, and he suggested that they go for a change and look at them, and added that he was very worried about her, and added that even Ed and Renee wouldn't have breakfast with her, because as she knows, Renee has an audience with the Crown Prince today. However, he said that her late-night seizure had caused everyone to not get enough sleep. Even his skin had become dull. He asked her to think about the feelings of her family, who were so worried about her, and not to be selfish. He started to say the last phrase in a raised tone of voice. Irina was shocked. She didn't understand why she hadn't noticed all this before. She used to think her father cared about her and loved her, and she can't believe he's been planning all this ever since. All this time he only wanted to kill and get rid of her. It is very hard for Irina to perceive this, especially considering the fact that she didn't know it before. He always pretended to worry about her. When it was cold, he gave her a cloak, and even hired a new doctor to cure her illness. It was a mystery to the girl why he wished to kill her, and she did not know. She wondered if everyone had deceived her. It was Time, and Ed, and Renee. But then Irina calmed down and decided that since she was able to be reborn by some miracle, she has to find out why her father wanted to kill her so badly he hired a doctor to do it. At this point, her father stepped closer to her and asked if she was listening to him at all. The girl didn't answer anything to that. She figured that this time she could survive just for the sake of it. Now she just had to be patient. Then she looked at the Count and apologized to him, making the most innocent and happy face possible. But my father said there was nothing wrong with that, and suggested we go out to eat at last. The girl agreed, and then they went out to have breakfast like a real father and daughter. When their food was finally brought to them, the Count said that according to the maid she had cried last night. Taking a bite of a piece of meat, he asked what was wrong with her that she didn't show it, no matter how much it hurt. Irina didn't touch her plate and apologized for making her worry. She explained that she just had a nightmare the night before. When her father heard this, he got very angry. He hit his fist hard on the table and asked her what the nightmare meant. Irina looked at him in surprise. She didn't understand why he suddenly had such an aggressive reaction. But she replied that yes, it was a nightmare. That's why she couldn't stop crying. When Irina was just a little girl, she dreamed that Ed and Renee were with her. But at that moment, the butler came up to them. He apologized to the gentleman and said that there was not much time left, and he had to be ready. The Count immediately left the table and started to follow him, saying that he would be right behind him. Irina wasn't really surprised that her father had taken off in the middle of their conversation, without even saying a word to her. Then the girl wondered what she should do now, how she should live her life. After a while, some blonde-haired girl in a beautiful and expensive dress began to approach her glass gazebo. She knocked on the glass door and asked her sister if everything was okay. Irina, seeing who had come to see her, said that yes, she could come in. At that moment, the door opened, and Renee Reinkars entered the room. She is the second daughter of the family. At this point, Irina wondered if she knew about everything her father was doing, but the girl came over and sat next to her at the table, starting to nibble on various cakes. The girl started poring over her sister and said that she was going to the royal palace today, but because of her, she couldn't get any sleep. This was really true because Renee was interrupting the whole conversation because she really wanted to yawn. But the girl said it was all right, for her sister's well-being was far more important than anything else. Then she looked at the cup of tea Irina had poured for herself and asked what she had. The girl hesitated. Apparently, she really didn't know anything. But she answered her sister that it was a tea that her father had acquired from the Henna Kingdom. Renee gasped in surprise and said that was expected from their dad. He was so worried about her. But Irina handed her a cup of tea and asked if she wanted to taste it. The girl lit up with happiness and asked if she could drink it. Irina looked at her sister confidently and said that of course she was allowed, Renee said, except that she was sure her father would swear in that case. Tea from the Henna Kingdom must be very expensive. The girl was silent for a while. Irina thought about what to do in such a case, and then told them to divide the tea for two and drink it. Then she poured a cup of this tea for Renee, and the girl was surprised and asked if she could really drink it. Irina wondered if she definitely knew nothing about all this, or if she was just good at pretending. Then my sister took a cup of tea and started sniffing its aroma before drinking it. Irina, watching all this, thought about the fact that her father was slowly killing her every day. At this time, the Count, who was walking through the estate to do his business, thought about what his daughter had said to him, and decided that she should not see her sons, for it was bad, and she should drink as much dandelion tea as possible. But after a while, Renee returned to the manor. When she saw her father, she waved happily. When she got closer, she asked if he was already leaving now. The girl tried to walk a little farther, but suddenly she felt dizzy and her legs stopped holding. Then her father picked her up and asked her where she was. The girl explained that she stopped by her sister's house before heading to the royal palace. The Count was immediately concerned. He turned to his daughter and asked if she had been drinking tea with her sister. But the girl ignored his words. She turned to the side and said that it was the same fragrance. Then she turned to her father and said it was the same smell of tea her sister was drinking, and she said her sister kindly agreed to share some with her. Her father immediately started yelling at her and telling her to spit it out sooner. Renee was surprised. She didn't understand why her father suddenly started yelling at her, so she asked what was wrong. At this point, the butler came over to them, trying to pull the Count away from his daughter, telling him to stop because he was hurting his mistress. But her father still yelled and told her to spit out that tea immediately, and started tapping her back. But at that moment, Irina suddenly came in and asked her father what was wrong. The Count immediately turned his attention to his second daughter and asked with a shout why she had let Renee drink her tea. Irina was surprised and asked if this tea wasn't good for the body. Why couldn't her sister drink it then? For a while, the Count didn't even know what to say to her. He was very angry, so he just breathed heavily. Then Renee couldn't take all the arguing anymore and screamed, turning to her father that she wouldn't drink it. Everyone was very surprised. Then the Count ran up to his daughter again and asked her if she really hadn't drunk anything. The girl screamed again and said that was right, she hadn't drunk anything. Then Irina entered the conversation again and listed why it was necessary to raise such a fuss. What was so terrible in this tea? Her father said that this tea is exclusively for unhealthy people, and it is only suitable for her. so only she and no one else can drink it. Then Irina said that now everything was clear. Then she turned around and started to leave, adding that she was tired, so she was going back to her room. As the girl walked out the door, she heard her father start yelling at his daughter again, and told Renee to never touch Irina's mug again. In fact, generation after generation in the Reinkars family has produced people with different abilities, but Irina has not shown any abilities. At this point, the girl stepped out onto the veranda and thought, why on earth did she have to die? After all, Count Reinkars had faithfully adored and cared for her, even though she had no powers. It was already starting to get dark, and Irina thought that was how she knew. But that trust killed her completely. Henry says she has the most powerful supernatural powers of any of her family. But she didn't really believe it. I mean, she shouldn't have killed her in the first place. As the stars rose in the sky, Henry came out on the veranda. He was holding a bundle of paper. He approached the girl and asked if she was in the room. He heard that she had had a seizure during the night, and she refused to call him. Irina was silent for a while, and then she asked him if he shouldn't worry about her first. The guy sighed heavily, and then said afterward that she felt so bad. His heart squeezed when he learned that she had suffered and cried in the middle of the night. Irina watched all the playfulness in his voice. At this moment, she thought that if she hadn't been revived to life, she would once again have that innocent expression on her face, and she would be fooled again. Henry said that if he could only be there for her, he doesn't want her to suffer alone. The girl suddenly felt very cold due to the fact that it was already evening outside, and she was without her cape. But she still thought she didn't want it all anymore. At this point, the guy noticed that she was getting very cold. Then he started to accompany her to the room and said that he had already told her to turn on the fireplace. But Irina replied that there was nothing wrong with her. She was just offended by him. When they went into the room, the guy was surprised and asked why she was suddenly offended. The girl said that honestly, it's been so long since she last had nightmares, and she can feel herself becoming unstable. Henry, hearing that she had had a nightmare, asked how that was possible. Irina said that it was indeed a real nightmare. Then the girl took hold of his face and began to move closer and closer to his lips. In fact, such a thing would never happen between an attending healer and the daughter of an aristocrat. Henry said he was well trained in medical school, but even after graduation, he remained a commoner. Irina thought that it must have all appeared so beautiful and inaccessible to her then that she became more and more interested in it. Then the girl suddenly pulled off his scarf and started examining it, saying it was so funny. The man was very surprised and asked what she was doing. He had a very frightened look on his face. At that moment, Irina thought that this was all a situation. It was a laughing matter. But now was not the time for all this. Then the guy asked her, did she really decide to play a joke on him? Irina looked at him and said she was very happy to be around him, and apologized for lying to him when she said she was scared. Henry got up from his knees and said another surprise. She really has been overwhelming him all day. But he added that he didn't mind it. Every prank she did only made him laugh and enthralled him even more. At that moment the girl thought that he did not know that stupid and naive Irina was gone. Then the girl looked at the bundle of paper that lay beside her on the couch, which Henry had carelessly left behind. She read there that the Duke of Lancaster had made the unthinkable claim that he would marry anyone who spent the night with him, and in doing so he set the whole empire on edge. The girl, having read about it, asked, "Is it really the Duke of Lancaster?" Henry came closer to her and said that this was the letter. Now the whole capital was talking exclusively about it. How can you marry anyone who spends the night with him? That's just some shameless girl agreeing to it. But Henry said he was actually surprised. He didn't think she was interested in something like that. The girl said she had just heard rumors. The Duke of Lancaster happens to be the Emperor's nephew and cousin to the Crown Prince. Already the entire empire has heard of his eccentric antics. There are even rumors that he was stolen as a baby. From that very moment on, he just lost his mind and doesn't even know what he's doing. But at this moment the girl's musings were interrupted by Henry's voice, who asked if she could tell him about her dream. The girl noticed that both Henry and her father were really starting to worry about her dreams. That surprised her a little. It was a very long ago memory, so Irina simply forgot about it. The events of that day came back to her mind. Renee's power is to prolong life, and compared to her mighty power, Ed's ability was weak, but he also had a special gift, namely to accelerate a person's inner growth. His ability is like roses that bloom in winter, and her ability is to appear to her father in his dreams, and it happened every night. The girl thought that maybe fate itself had given her this chance. Well, then she looked at the guy and said it was no big deal. Then she asked him why they shouldn't leave this conversation and go for a walk together. Henry was very surprised that she wanted to go for a walk with him, but the girl offered to go in secret from her father. Sitting in the mansion all the time, she can feel herself suffocating from the stuffiness, and she needs at least a small breath of fresh air. Henry hesitated and said that her father was just worried about her. Irina replied that she was sure if he was with her, her father wouldn't mind. Afterward, she said that her father had not been himself this morning. She thought maybe she could cheer him up with a little present. Henry was surprised and asked if she really wanted to give a gift to the Earl, but Irina came closer to him and offered to buy classic literature, because her father really likes to read. The man hesitated and afterwards said it would be very expensive. Well, the girl replied that he didn't have to worry about that. After all, she had money, and they could look for some magical artifact for him. Then the guy moved closer to her and whispered in her ear that since that was the case, he didn't mind. Irina replied in a cheerful voice that he should wait for her at the gate, and she would prepare a carriage for them in the meantime. When the boy was about to leave the room, the girl shouted at him to be careful. She thought to herself that there would be no second chance, and she owes it to herself to just meet whoever she's up to. After a while, Irina got ready and went downstairs. They had already boarded the carriage. The man asked if they could go to the bookstore first, but Irina ignored his question and asked if he knew anything about the labyrinth. The man had a rather sharp reaction, so he asked about the labyrinth. Irina wondered what had surprised him so much. She wanted to visit the bookstore in the labyrinth. Then she giggled and asked if he was thinking of something vulgar. When the boy wanted to say something, she interrupted him immediately, and she said she heard it was her father's favorite store. She doesn't know if it's really in the red light district, but the store is quite famous among gentlemen. Irina smiled and said that maybe they could find something worthwhile there. Besides, the labyrinth was close to the mage's quarter, so it would be convenient for them. Henry said that she was right in principle, and the girl went on talking and added that she had a very good feeling about it, and she thought that she had to survive at all costs, and soon it would be her greatest revenge on him. But at that moment, Henry said that in truth, he knew a bookstore in the maze. It was there that he met the Count for the first time. The girl was surprised and asked, "Did he really meet his father in the labyrinth?" The man confirmed and said he didn't have any money when he was a student, so he decided to go there. At this moment the girl thought, "Counts, a young man who studies medicine, what could they possibly need in the labyrinth?" However, it's not really important right now, because it's more important. For the girl, it's to survive. And so after a while the wagon stopped. The coachman got out and said that they had arrived. And as soon as Pyle opened the door, Irina immediately swept him off his feet and started running after him. She shouted apologies to him for knocking him down. The girl thought she was obliged to spend the night with the Duke of Lancaster. Then Henry ran out of the carriage after her and shouted for her to stop. But the girl did not react. She kept running, and then she ran around an alley and saw a man standing nearby. He said he'd help her. The girl ran after this silhouette and ended up next to some boy in a dark alley. Already somewhere in the distance she could hear Kendra's voice asking, "Where is she?" But it was getting quieter and quieter. Irina followed this boy and went through the archway. Then she felt kind of sick, and after a while she fell to the ground, feeling a strong headache. Looking around, the girl did not realize where she was, and so, as she looked out, she saw some strange and unfamiliar place. There was water running through it and a terrible stench. The boy said she needn't worry because they went down the sewer. His name was Tom. He was a boy from the slums. But then Tom held out his hand and said, "That's 2 pieces of silver. That was payment for helping her." Irina was surprised. She looked up in search of a way out. The girl still didn't understand much about what had happened. Then the boy examined her from head to toe and said her clothes were all wet. But at that moment, Irina held out her hand to him, which contained a precious pebble, and told him to take it. Tom was very surprised and asked if she was sure she wanted to give it to him. After all, it was very expensive. But the girl told him to take it. And before he did, There was something else she wanted to ask him. Tam was surprised, but he asked what else she wanted. Irina looked at the boy and asked him to take her to the Martel Hotel. She thought to herself that there was no way she was going to die that easily. The boy thought about her request for a while. After that, he picked up what she had given him, a really precious thing. So he told her to follow him. That's how they traveled through the sewer channels to the hotel. They walked through the water, which was very cold and dirty. Irina had heeled shoes, and so she accidentally hooked herself over and fell. Tom, noticing this, immediately went over to her. He held out his hand to her and told her to take hold of it, for it was very dark in the sewers. The girl took his hand and thanked him for it. When she stood up, they walked on. Tom said that a little longer and they would see the street lights. This is the route for the guard patrol, so they need to hurry. Irina said they would do as he said. Then the guy looked at her and asked her why she needed to go to the Martel Hotel. They were still holding hands because the sewers were hard to navigate, and the girl replied that she wanted to meet someone there. At this time, Duke Ian Lancaster was sitting in his room. He wondered if people were already discussing him. After all, there are quite a few women in the capital who really like him and are just fanatical about him. He turned to his personal assistant and said that pretending to notice attention from women is not at all beneath gentlemanly. His personal assistant's name was Hugh, and he told his host that he should be careful. At this point, Tom and Irina finally arrived at door number 305. The boy said that they had already arrived, and all she has to do is climb the stairs and the hotel will be right across the street. The girl turned to the boy and thanked him. After that, she handed him the jewelry. Tom immediately began to examine it. It was a beautiful stone, gleaming in the light, and the boy loved to watch it. Then Irina said that this jewelry was worth at least 1 gold coin. The boy was very surprised to hear that. Then the girl decided to introduce herself and said that her name was Irina Reinkars. Tom, hearing this surname, was very surprised. And the girl said that's right, she's Reinkars. He needn't worry though, she wouldn't tell anyone about him. Irina also added that she thinks she herself knows how valuable that button is. The boy clenched it in his fist and said in a sad voice that he knew. Irina came close to him and told him that if anyone took her away from him, he could hardly buy her back for a fair price. The boy hesitated and said nothing. Then she asked what his name was. Tom said his name. Then she asked if he would be willing to help her. In that case, he would never again wander in the darkness of the gutters. The boy was surprised and asked if it was true. Irina said yes. At least that way she would be able to offer him a lot more than 1 button. Tom immediately inquired what he needed to do. The girl replied that she needed to steal someone away for 1 night tonight, and asked if he could help her with that. Meanwhile, Henry was walking the streets looking for the girl. It was getting dark, but he kept looking. He could not understand where Irina had gone, and why she had run away so quickly. Then some girl dressed in Irina's clothes began to pass by. Henry immediately ran up to her. He roughly yanked the girl back and asked, "Is it really Irina?" Then the girl looked angrily at Henry and asked what it was he wanted. The man immediately moved away from her and apologized. At this time, Irina was still in the sewer. She sat not far from the door, and closing her eyes, heard someone's voice again. He said the darkness would let go, and the stars would bloom when the month hit her. Let her tread in the shadows. But at that moment, Irina heard someone else's voice. It was already more tender and loving. He was humming some kind of melody. The girl thought, whose song is this? Could it be her mom's? And at that moment, she seemed to feel someone touching her head. It was like a ray of light in the darkness. In order to enhance his family's abilities, Irina's father married a woman he didn't love and had children with her. In the beginning, the girl's illness was similar to that of her mother, from which she died. In fact, in Irina's memories, her mom looks much different than in her dreams. But at that moment, Tom approached the girl. He turned to her and asked if she was all right. Irina told the boy that she just needed to get some rest, and then everything would be fine. Then she told Tom to sit down next to her. The boy took out a bottle of water and asked his mistress what she was going to do when she met that man. Irina took the water and said that she was going to change her life completely. After their conversation, he went upstairs and found himself right in front of the hotel doors. The boy immediately remembered the words of the girl who had asked him to take her there. Then he dared and went inside. He was met by a bald man who stood behind the reception desk. Tom apologized for bothering him. but said his mistress wanted to spend the night with the most handsome man in their hotel. He then took a button out of his pocket and said that he would get this in return. The man immediately held out his hand and told the boy to give it to him. Then the receptionist began to scrutinize this gemstone button, and after a while he put it in his pocket, saying it was very surprising that some rich lady had come to the forgotten hotel. Then he handed the boy the golden key to the hotel room. Tom immediately smiled. He was glad that he had succeeded in doing what his mistress had told him to do. After that, the boy returned again. The mistress was still sitting and resting. Then he handed her the jar and told her to help herself. The girl was very surprised and asked what it was. Tom explained that he had bought it with the money he had been given yesterday. He also said that he gave one to his sister and brought the other for her. Irina was shocked that a boy she didn't know at all decided to give her his share. It was probably the first time someone had been so kind to her, and also a complete stranger. Then she thanked him and added that she would not refuse such a good thing. Tom asked what mistress was going to do after all when she met this man. Irina repeated herself and said that certainly she wants to drastically change her life for the better. But the boy was very surprised and asked if it could be done so easily. The girl said that it certainly could. It was possible that she might not succeed, but she looked at him and added that it would be much better than just sitting back and not even trying to change things. At this moment, Tom took out of his pocket the gold key he had been given at the hotel and held it out to the girl. Irina immediately took it and thanked the boy for everything he had done, and afterwards she added that all that was left was to wait for night. After a while, the boy and the girl got out of the sewer and found themselves in some building. Tom looked out the window and saw two men standing nearby talking about something. He turned to the girl, who was wearing dark clothes and a hoodie, saying they could go out the front door. Then they went. It was already quite dark outside. Irina approached the boy and said that he didn't have to go with her at all. They stopped, and the girl told him to take the button to the Duke of Lancaster in 2 days, and also to remember to take his sister. Tom threw his bag of miscellaneous things he needed over his shoulder and said, "Okay, that's what he'll do." Before leaving, Irina waved him goodbye and told him to pray for her success. And so, after some time, the girl came to the hotel and, going up to the floor, she began to open the doors to the 306th room. When the key turned and the door was unlocked, the girl hesitated for a long time to pull the handle and go inside. Still, she got to her courage and walked into the room. After a while, Ian himself came out of his room. He turned to his assistant and asked if he would be kidnapped today. Hugh asked if he wasn't expecting that himself. The guy ignored his teasing and asked if he'd seen her face. The aide explained that the girl had sent her servant, so he hadn't seen her live. Ian hesitated and said that he couldn't wait to see what kind of girl would show up at his door. Meanwhile, Irina had already entered the room. She went to the window and took off her hood, thinking it was her only chance. The girl tried to reassure herself, thinking that everything would be fine and nothing bad would happen. Everything would go according to plan. After a while, Ian returned to the room. He took a hot bath with rose petals and sipped his red wine, which was like blood. After the man finished his bath, he put on his robe and said he was ready, asking, "What about her?" The man, finding himself with himself, afterward made his way to the bedroom and lay down on the bed to get some rest. But at that moment he heard some rustling, and when he looked he saw a girl with bright red hair appear from behind the curtain. Ian was very much surprised. He looked at her and immediately asked who she was. The girl came closer to him and asked him if he could see her. Then the man was horrified, started covering himself with his hands, and told her not to come any closer. However, the girl did not obey him. She came closer and closer to him, all the while asking if he could see her. Then the man said he could see her very well and asked who she was. The girl climbed on top of him, all the while asking if he could see her. Ian was very frightened, asking what she wanted and what she was up to. Then he looked the girl in the eyes and asked if she was crazy in some way. However, the girl asked if he didn't realize where they were. Ian replied that they were on his bed, but the girl objected and said they were not. Then everything suddenly changed in the man's eyes, and they were standing on the freshly cut grass. The girl was not surprised. She told the man that it was all a dream. They had already found themselves in a deep and dark forest. The best scented candles, warm pajamas, and a bed for the most comfortable sleep. Having prepared everything, the man closed his eyes and immediately fell asleep. In fact, Ian doesn't suffer from insomnia at all. However, nevertheless, the night was stolen from him. and it was done by a girl he had never seen before. The first time they met was in that very dream of his. When they found themselves in the woods, the girl said that you could even say she had spent the night with him. However, Ian didn't listen to her much and asked, "Is this really his dream?" He looked around and asked, "Does she really mean to say that he's asleep right now and it's all in his head?" The girl said it was just like that. Then the man went over and plucked some flowers, saying that he couldn't believe he was really asleep. He then added that it would be very interesting and cool to take to the skies. Then the girl immediately went to him and told him that if she got stronger, he could do it too. And then for a moment, as he turned away in the other direction, a beautiful lake appeared, with moonlight shining on it. The man was as if intoxicated by such beauty. Then he began to undress. The girl was surprised and asked him what he was doing, but Ian didn't answer her. He undressed and went into the water up to his waist. The girl shouted at him that the water was too cold to swim in. However, the man smiled and said that they were in a dream after all, so there was no difference. He couldn't get sick. Then he began to wash his face, and everything around him suddenly glowed with bright flames. The man said that it was all very amazing and unbelievable. Afterward, he felt like diving underwater and enjoyed what he was experiencing in his dream. After a while he was underwater, the girl noticed that her body was starting to weaken and the scenery was disappearing. Irina realized she didn't have much time left, and she had to talk him into marrying her before he woke up. The girl realized that she would have to tell him who she really was after all, so she decided to approach him. Ian, at that moment, was just about to surface. When Irina came closer to him, she apologized and said she had to get back. She grabbed his hand and asked if he could at least listen a little when spoken to. Ian asked in surprise what was wrong. Then, as if remembering, he said he had to get dressed and started walking toward the shore. Irina was surprised. She had to tell him everything as soon as possible, because she didn't have much time left. But the man said that even if it was a dream, he was embarrassed to be in front of a lady like that, and he covered his chest with his hands. The girl didn't know what he was talking about, but then she turned around and saw that she was standing completely naked. Irina was surprised that she had no clothes on and wondered, had she really come to him in her dream naked? Then she quickly began to get under the water so that he would not see her. Then she got mad at him and said he was just some kind of pervert. Ian laughed and said that it was the girl who appeared to him in his dream without clothes that was telling him this. Irina was angry. She was surprised but shouted that only if he never woke up, calling him an idiot. But the man laughed again and said that he was grateful to her for those words. Irina noticed that she had no more strength. However, she must not give up. She must try her best and tell him her name. But at that moment, the man noticed that something was happening and said that her body was disappearing, asking if she was okay. But after that, everything disappeared before his eyes, and the man began to hear a distant voice like someone calling him. Ian felt some sort of jolt afterward and immediately woke up. He looked straight in front of him and saw his aide and wondered what the feeling was. Had he really slapped him? Hugh ignored his question and asked if he was okay, and added that he was about to go get a doctor. The Duke explained that he had had a dream that was quite interesting, and in some ways even incomprehensible. The assistant immediately became worried and asked if he was hallucinating. In fact, when Ian is overworked, he resorts to medication. He also only falls asleep with their help. Some of them contain a lot of narcotic components. It is very difficult to call it sleep. Rather, he falls just unconscious. Without this medicine, the Duke is bound to go insane. So he occasionally sees hallucinations, confusing them with real life. But Ian told his assistant not to mix it up. It was indeed a dream, a very real one. The man was very happy that he was finally able to dream like normal people. Then he began to remember everything that had happened, and remembering that he had dreamt about a girl, he immediately wondered who it was. However, Hugh objected and said that he had told him that it was a side effect of the medicine, not some kind of dream after all. The man looked at him contemptuously and said he was ashamed of him. Hugh laughed and said that for once, Ian Lancaster was starting to feel ashamed. And after that, he realized he had said something unnecessary and immediately covered his mouth with his hand. However, the Duke paid no attention to him. He was still thinking about his dream and about that girl. The boy decided that he would never forget her. Then Ian got out of bed and went to the window. He opened the curtains, which let the new day's sunlight into the dark room. The man looked out over the city, opening the window and letting in the fresh air, and thought he felt very invigorated. It was the first time in a very long time that he finally felt rested after a nap. He looked outside and just stood there smiling. Ian was very happy about what had happened last night. At this moment, Hugh looked at the Lord and said that if he had killed a person, he better let him admit it right away. Considering the side effects of the medicine, he wouldn't be surprised if he committed such a thing as well. But Ian said nothing to this. He continued to stand at the window. Then the assistant turned to the Duke and asked if he was all right. Then the Duke stood silent for a while. Then he turned to his assistant and told him to bring him the woman with whom he had spent the night. Before all this, as the sun was just beginning to rise, the girl in her 306th room awoke with a startled start. She immediately woke up and realized it was shameful. She showed her body to the man she was meeting for the first time. Besides, she never managed to achieve her goal that she wanted. Irina was very upset with herself. She looked out the window and thought that she would have to go home in the morning because she couldn't do otherwise. After all, if her father found out about it, he would ban her from his room forever, just like a cage. After a while, Irina had already gathered herself and went out into the corridor, thinking that being locked up like a bird in a cage was her fate. A few days after Irina returned to the estate, she came to see her father. He was drinking red wine and asked if she had really spent the night with Henry. Irina was surprised. She was wearing a beautiful red dress that emphasized her figure. She asked her father what he meant by that. The man replied that 2 days ago the maid told him she had waited for her in her room, but she never returned. Irina screamed, saying it was all nonsense and her father knows she would never do such a thing, doesn't he? Then the Earl set down his wine glass and said that he had decided to postpone her wedding to an earlier date. Irina was shocked. She said that Henry was certainly a very nice man, but that didn't mean she wanted to marry him, and asked if her father really thought she could spend the night with him. Raincars said someone saw her and Henry in the maze. No one wanted her. It's true. Honor is more important to an aristocrat than life, and she took it and tarnished it. Irina was surprised but more still angry. She wondered if no one really wanted the truth. Then where was Henry himself? Her father rudely told her to go to her room and think about her behavior. The girl blurted out that she just couldn't believe it, but her father still said she would marry Henry before the end of spring. Irina cried out with tears in her eyes that there was no way she would do that. The Count slammed his fist on the table and asked, "So why did they go to the labyrinth then, besides taking and sleeping in a house that wasn't theirs?" Her father said that the Count's daughter must not do such a thing, no way. She must take responsibility for what she did. Irina screamed and said that her father had taken it upon himself to lie to him. She would never have done such vulgar things with him in her life. The Count thought about it and said that Henry is a good man. He is the one she misses in her life. The girl was surprised and asked if he meant to say that they were a good couple. She asked if he thought that the daughter of the Count of Raincars and a commoner doctor were the way to go. The girl thought maybe at least this way she could put him in his place. But at that moment a man walked into their room. Irina immediately turned around to see who it was. Henry walked in on them and asked that they all calm down because the lady needed peace. At this moment, Irina wondered, was she really that much despised? Then she took all her will in her fist and turned to the guy and told him that he was just in time. Then she asked him to tell her what had happened that day. But Henry turned to the girl and said that they had no reason at all to hide the events of that day. Irina was surprised by his answer. She certainly hadn't expected him to start lying. Henry lowered his head and said that he should apologize for not noticing her feelings sooner. After that, he smiled evilly and added that who would have thought that a noble lady was capable of such things. At that moment, Irina thought that even now he was unable to hold back his smirk. It's like she's in a real hell. She doesn't want to see any of this. It was raining heavily outside the window, with occasional lightning and thunder. Everyone in the room was silent for a while, thinking about the words they had heard. But at that moment Henry came up to the girl, put his hand on hers, and addressed her. She didn't expect anything like that, but he took it suddenly and kissed her hand. Irina's brother and sister were shocked when they saw all this. The girl, when she realized what was happening, immediately yanked her hand away and asked what he was doing. Henry was shocked at this reaction. He didn't understand what was going on or why she was acting so angry. Well, then he looked at her with a pitiful look and said that every night he sees her suffering from fever, balancing between life and death. He also said that he really wanted to ease her suffering. After that, he got to his feet and said that he fell in love with her at first sight. He then got down on one knee again and began to say something, but the girl immediately interrupted him and asked Dr. Henry what he was up to. But the boy said that he was already talking after all. However, Irina interrupted again and said that she was the eldest daughter of the Reinkars family, and every man was willing to sacrifice anything just to kiss her foot. Everyone was in shock. Irina's family did not know what would happen next and how the girl would respond to it. Irina herself, however, took to kicking Henry in the stomach with her foot as hard as she could. The man fell to the floor. He looked at the girl in surprise, not understanding what was going on or why she was acting like this. Then Irina looked at him and laughed. She wasn't going to put up with any more of this. So she finally took action. The father, who had been standing there watching all this for a while, suddenly slapped his hand on the table and told his daughter that this was not how he had raised her at all. Then Irina glimpsed at him and replied in an angry voice that he had not brought her up at all. He just took her and treated her like a doll and a toy that nobody wanted. Her father objected and said that she herself knew why this was happening. After all, she was in poor health. But she replied that she was so wrong to think that he really loved and cared for her. Then the father was surprised and said that he loved his daughter very much. Irina thought that was too hypocritical even for him. Even after going back in time, she hoped that her family wasn't that bad, that her father really cared about her and wanted happiness for the girl. But now all her hopes were dashed, and her rose-colored glasses were finally removed from her eyes, and she saw the whole truth. Irina realized that no one wanted her in this house, and no one wanted even a drop of happiness for her. The father went up to the girl. He wanted to comfort her, but Irina objected and shouted, saying that she would not marry Henry under any circumstances. Then the Count asked in surprise what else she could do. Then he looked at Henry and thought, that idiot should have shouted Irina's name all over the street. Then the guy who was still sitting on the floor finally got up. He approached the girl and asked her if she had forgotten the events of that night. Irina turned to Henry and told him to stop lying already, because no one would believe him. But at this point, her father yelled at her and told her to stay out of it, and no one asked her to say anything. Then another man came into their room. He asked why the servants in the house were so slow, or if they just liked snails. He then looked at Irina, smiled at her and said hello, saying that he wished he could have really slept longer. It was a pity that he had been woken up. All three of them, both the Count, Henry, and Irina, were shocked by such a statement. However, Ian walked a little farther into the room, approached the Earl, and said it was a pleasure to meet him. Ronald, who is Irina's father, asked if he had forgotten since they had met before. At this moment, the Count himself became angry. He looked at the boy and thought that he had barged into someone else's dining hall without warning. At that moment, Henry came up to Irina. He took her hand and suggested that she go to her room because she needed to rest. The girl tried to free herself from his arms, but she couldn't. Henry's grip was very strong. Then she realized that the usual way was not going to work, so she began to wriggle out of his arms and scream that she was in a lot of pain and that she wanted him to let her go soon. Ian then shifted his gaze to the man and asked who he even was and started to walk closer to them. Henry said he was her personal physician. For a while they just looked at each other. But then the Duke shifted his gaze to the girl and told Irina that she was very good at playing hide-and-seek. And if it wasn't for that guy, he might have had to scour the entire capital looking for her. At this point, Ronald intervened in the conversation. He turned to the Duke of Lancaster and said that apparently his lovely daughter had made him uncomfortable. He did not know what she had done, but he would punish her properly. When Ian heard this, he was very surprised and asked why she had done something wrong, and also added, does he really want to punish her right away without even asking her about what happened or finding out all the details of the situation? The Earl didn't understand what was going on. But then Ian smiled and replied that he would say that he was the one who had wronged his daughter. The man was surprised and asked what he meant by that. The Duke said he would let him come unannounced, but he wouldn't make the guests stand around all that time. Ronald then said that they were having a family squabble right now, and he would visit another day, asking if he could just leave now. Ian looked at him in surprise and wondered if he was chasing him away. At this point, He reflected that if it hadn't been for the advice from Hugh, he would have originally taken Irina into his possession, and there wouldn't have been all this. Then already Irina turned to her father and told him to stop, for Ian had come to see her. Ian stepped forward and said that he had come at the invitation of Lydia Irina, so he had no intention of obeying him. Ronald was about to object, but the Duke interrupted him and said that Lady Irina was already an adult. He went around to the other side and told her that he was going to have dinner with his daughter and spend another night with her. And then he asked why he was in the way of such a thing. Ronald became indignant and asked what he was talking about, but Ian interrupted him and said he wasn't going to talk to him standing up. Well, if he heard correctly, he's asking to be allowed to say that his daughter didn't spend the night with that shallow man. And with those words, he pointed to Henry, namely with him Ian Lancaster. The girl's father was shocked. He couldn't believe it was true. Then Irina looked at the guy who was standing next to him and said that he arrived later than she expected. The Duke replied that he must admit she was too skilled at hiding. With these words, he smiled. Then the girl moved closer to him, and looking straight into his eyes said that she hoped he liked it. Ian then approached Earl Ronald Rhinecars and asked his permission to marry his daughter. When Henry heard this, he objected and said that he was her fiancé, not some obscure Ian. Ian at this point thought he was counting on a strong girl coming to spend the night with him, but apparently she just wanted to break her engagement. At this point, Ed came up to Henry and told him that his sister already had a fiancé. In fact, the Duke understands perfectly well why she did it, since her whole family just wants to get rid of her. At this point, a guy came out a little closer and said he was Irina's younger brother, and his name was Ed Rhinecars. Ian immediately glowed with joy, said it was a pleasure to meet him, and introduced himself and what his name was. The guy then thought that if it was her younger brother, the young man left behind was her fiancé. Irina moved closer to him and said that she herself had found out this morning, but nevertheless she had no intention of marrying him. Ed spoke up again and said that it was all a family matter, and only the father could decide who Irina's fiancé would be and no one else. Her brother took Irina's hand and told her to go to the room with Henry. The girl was surprised and wondered if he had turned on the most caring brother in the world, so she thought he was absolutely exactly like her father. She wondered if he thought she was obliged to marry Henry, even if it meant her death. At this moment, the Duke turned to Ed and told him to quickly let her go, and after that he asked, even though he knew that his sister had attacked him mercilessly. Ed was surprised and asked what he was even talking about. Irina didn't expect such words either. Ian said he was talking about what happened when they spent the night together, and after that event, frank and innocent, he slept the whole day away. He didn't even notice how long it took him to open his eyes. Then he turned to the Count and addressed him. Ian said the reason he wants to marry his daughter is because she raped him and just ran away, and he asks for Irina's hand in marriage so that she can answer for the deed. Irina wondered what rape meant. It was quite unexpected to hear such a word from an aristocrat, for it was a vulgar word often used by commoners. Well, then the girl looked at her father's reaction and thought that this was exactly what was needed. Henry was about to say something, but Ian gestured him to be silent and turned to the Earl again, saying that if he were of sound mind, he would never marry her to a doctor. Besides, it's a good enough chance to breed with the Lancaster family and take an even higher position in society. After some time of silence, Ian asked, "So what does he think about it?" Irina was shocked. She couldn't understand what he was up to and why he was saying all these things. Ian Lancaster is an aristocrat who rules the lands in the north of the Empire. The whole world knows that he is the son of His Majesty's sister. To top it all off, he announced to the Emperor, as if nothing had happened, that he would marry anyone who could spend the night with him. It was certainly brave enough, but still a reckless act. But it's not over yet. He is considered a consummate hero who wins wars with both monsters and humans. A man who can easily surpass any ideal is Ian Lancaster, every civilian's hero. That's why Irina chose him. She thought that he could easily protect and stand up for her. However, the girl is not sure whether it was the right thing to do. After a while of silence, Ian looked at the blood and asked if they wanted to go against the Lancaster family. But at that moment Irina interrupted him and turned. The guy immediately turned and, calling her his sweetheart, asked what was wrong. The girl said that he should discuss it with her first. At that moment Irina thought that it was too sudden a proposal. Of course, becoming the wife of the Duke of Lancaster is the easiest way out. However, she knows 2 examples of marriage with a man she doesn't love, which ended sadly. The first is her mother, and the second is herself. At this point, Ronald yelled for them to stop and asked what his daughter had done. In fact, Irina doesn't even have to guess what he's thinking right now. He thinks she's a very clueless daughter. And apparently he's going to have to fatten her up properly again, and she's going to be a very good lamb for slaughter.